how do I re-indigenize myself? How do I find place and connect myself if my umbilical cord is somewhere in medical waste and my
Back
ancestors
in the
were.
atmosphere. Welcome to episode 2 of Hopecast. So nice to see you again, Chrisna.
Very nice to see you, Dominic. To remind new people coming in, I'm Chrisna Duplessis and my co-host is
I'm
Dominic
Dominique
Hess. There we go.
Yeah, and we've started this Hopecast as a reflection on a book that we wrote 10 years ago called Designing for Hope, which, as part of this series of podcasts, we are giving away the chapters that we're talking about in a higher resolution, or you can download the whole book at a lower resolution, or you can buy a hard copy at cost. So very much trying to create this conversation around the Designing for Hope book and the ideas that we had 10 years ago and how they've evolved over the next 10 years. Here in Australia, we start with an acknowledgement to country, which is really about being grateful for the land in which we live and everything that it provides. And I wanted to share a really wonderful metaphor that was written by Jo Ray in a 2018 article with Neil Harrison when they're describing the methodology. And this is a methodology in Sydney to look at some histories, some Indigenous and settlers' histories. And as I read this, because I'm going to read it so that I quote this correctly as it was written by Jo and Neil, think about the critical issues we're facing today and how it's hard to listen to the other side at the moment. There seems to be a real us and them. And so as I read this, just reflect on that. So, and quoting, the uniqueness of this article lies in the storying urban connections to place in the contemporary landscape of Sydney. The method adopted of this project involves goanna walking. Now, little interjection, goanna is like a big lizard, so a big kind of monitor lizard, so you can look them up. But they leave these prints in the sand and these squiggly tails that go between footprints. So, like the goanna, we use our eyes and our ears to observe and listen to all that we meet. Our tongues allow us to test, to read and translate what we learn. And while we use our steps on the right and on the left to progress, it is the trails in the sand at the centre from our tales, or tales as in stories, that mark our continuity. And so from that, I pay respect to that wisdom in the land, in the animals, and in the things we can observe and reflect on. And it's really, for me, the magic is that, literate, oral, east, west, mechanistic, ecological, these are different ways of walking together. And the magic is in how we weave the best of everything together in how we progress into the future. So with that, let's get started. And the start of our book was really talking about the stories that we tell and how those stories have led us to where we are. So, Chrisna, what are your reflections on the stories that we tell ourselves and 10 years on?
I think this whole goanna metaphor is such a fantastic way of looking at it because there's a story that we've been telling for the past 30, 40 years is that we have conflicting stories between there's an old story that we need to get rid of, and there's a new story that is emerging. But actually, we need both of these stories to work together. As Ken Wilber wrote in Integral Theories, it's about including and transcending. So it's how do we take this and make it something that becomes larger than it all. So we have the stories of the mechanistic side or the enlightenment side, or what Charles Eisenstein calls the stories of separation, reductionism. There's many ways of how we talk it that basically took humans out of nature, took it out of the community of life. And so we're very special. We're standing one side. And that means that we can now observe and study everything else. And if we understand everything else, we are able to control it so that we can make use of it for ourselves. And I think that's the big story. And that is the story that has created the negative impact, is the story of taking us out of the community of life. But in that process, we've developed a whole lot of things that has really helped us to make the world better for humans in any case, in many ways. Improved health outcomes, some educational outcomes, technology that has helped us to do certain things. And nobody wants to go
Art,
back to
music.
before that. Music, arts, all of those kind of things. Although I think art and music is part of human DNA. I don't think it's something that is part of
True,
that.
true.
But the ways that we can do it, and for me, what the biggest thing came out of it is it allowed us to communicate and to expand our ways of communications from the printing press to now where we are sitting, you in Australia, I'm in South Africa, and we've got listeners all over the world. And we are able to communicate in real time, and we are able to bring together all these various stories so that we can create something that transcends these stories and create something that is much, much better and bigger than what we have at the moment. So that's, I think, the new story that we need to tell is the story of a coming together.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
not of a shifting, letting go of bad stories and only thinking that new stories only is going to be the good thing. And I think that's part of what is good around worldviews is that worldviews is as we develop them, they get to a point where we realize that they've got flaws, and then we have to start investigating those flaws and find new stories to explain those flaws. And in the process, we evolve a new worldview. And that's the story what we are now, is we are evolving this new worldview. Um, I don't know if you want to chip in. I'm talking a lot here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, no. And it's in the shifting of those worldviews that we
Mm,
get some of this conflict and the old view worldviews kind of
mm,
fighting back as it no longer sees its relevance and it's trying to prove its relevance. And so we're seeing some of that. For me, as I was reflecting on the stories, I remember being really struck by David Corton's book, Change the Story,
mm,
Change the Future. In this, he unpacked the stories that we've told ourselves. And if we think about, the book was about bringing regenerative development and the background of regenerative development into practice. And often regenerative practice is about, the flows of water and air and creating that vitality in place. But we are social beings within a social ecological framework. So the social bits of the stories we tell are the ways we make sense of the world, are our worldviews. And the ones that he unpacked, and again, I'm just having a look at my notes so that I say them correctly, but it was the sacred money, that money,
mm,
if you have money, you have success and all of that. So he unpacks that. The distant patriarchy, that idea that you can manage a world from somewhere not in
mm,
that place. So he challenges that. And then he challenges the story of the grand machine so that we can stand aside from the
mm,
world and analyze it and understand it and pull it apart and then make it do we want it to do. And so he pulls those apart and then he says what the future story needs to be is the sacred life, the living earth story. And so what's that? Which very
mm.
much aligns with where we were going to with that sense of the ecological worldview.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, that chapter two, most of what we did in chapter two of the book actually came from my PhD, where I was trying to figure out what is this ecological worldview. And what I found is that you start finding patterns in current sciences or the new sciences, quantum physics, ecology, neurobiology, all of these new sciences that we've come to discover. But there's also the same patterns that we find in philosophical traditions, that we find in Indigenous knowledge systems. And now it is fantastic to see the rise of Indigenous knowledge systems. When I did the PhD, what is it now, 15 years ago, there was very little written in terms of Indigenous knowledge, mainly because it was a knowledge that was kept close and other outsiders were not allowed into that knowledge system. And you had a few people who would publish about it, and they would actually get a lot of flack around that. And now it's become a lot more open, and I think that is opened a lot of people's eyes to that this is not a new story. It's a re-emerging story, but it is coming back with much more support, much more depth of knowledge that is founded in science, in this other religion that we have developed that says this is the truth, and this shall be the only truth. And so for me, it's this coming together of a story that has a very specific flavor, and it is about, firstly, that we're talking about the whole, that everything, we need to look at the whole. We can't just look at parts of the whole, and we need to see the parts in relationship to the whole. Or as Jan Smuts in his book Holism and Evolution talk about the parts in creative synthesis and what that would mean. And part of that story of the whole is the story of relationship, that it's everything comes about because of relationships, whether you are looking at things in the quantum field, whether you are looking at global economic systems, it's all about relationship. And then the third bit of that is the idea that change is the only constant, that everything changes, and how do we respond to change is what defines us and helps us to thrive and to continue functioning and to continue maintaining the integrity of this fantastic whole. So for me, those are the key things. And I think part of the story that we got lost is that when we talk about this, we think about the physical. We just think about the exterior world. We're not also thinking about the interior world. The values, the stories, the insight, the emotions, the creativity, everything that comes with the interior. And part of that bringing together that wholeness is to bring together that exterior and the interior worlds as well. And that's, I think, where we can learn a lot from the Indigenous knowledge systems, is how do we rebuild this kind of relationship?
Yeah, that for me also has been part of my biggest reflection over the last 10 years, is that it's the relationship between people and place and their environment and each other, and the capacity for people to have agency, to be involved in their place, to care for their place, to look after their place. And it's in that building of that relationship. And the Regenesis group talk about, you're yourself within a project, your project's within a community, your community's within your state, and you have influences within and without, within and but the capacity to influence those systems is enabled by how much you work on yourself within that system. So how well do you understand yourself and your positives and negatives and your traumas, and how you influence the system around you? And so it's as much about the inside and you as it is, how the community is and the projects that you initiate. And that for me was the biggest learning. And so where I went to with all of that, because as you all know, listeners, is that I'm a pretty pragmatic person. And I remember Bill and I had a huge argument about ontology and all of those words. And I was like, just let's just do it. And so for me, how that looked was to start working on sort of the place making and the connecting of people to place, and creating locally enabled change and working with place and environment, from that sense of, okay, people are starting to be disconnected from place, and that's leading to some of the not caring for nature, not caring for each other, or being insular and looking at our boxes instead of outside and talking to our neighbours. And so for me, it was investigating at that level that helped me to look at those social aspects of regenerative development. And within that, there was a huge exploration of my own, because I'm an introvert. And, talking to my neighbours isn't my natural habitat. And so that there's an example of that inner and outer. If that's important, then I have to work on this bit. Yeah.
I think for me, being the philosophical one, where a lot of my thinking has gone to is this notion of the link between us and place. We know, where am I indigenous to? And in the African cultures, in isiZulu, for example, if you want to ask somebody, where do you come from? You ask Uvelapi, where is your umbilical cord buried? So that is what gives you, this is my place. This is where my umbilical cord is buried. And then I thought, but all the white people in this country, our umbilical cords got sent off in the trash and incinerated as medical waste. And so for me, this whole big thing becomes about how do I find my place? How do I re-indigenize myself somewhere? And there's a wonderful article by Lila June Johnson. She is a Dene woman from Canada, and she talks about how she's part Irish, and how she, in a ceremony, discovered that she connected to her European ancestors and not the Dene ancestors, and her whole journey about going back and understanding Indigenous European thinking. And so these kind of thinkings about where do I fit in, this is, as you are sitting a white woman in Australia, I'm a white woman in Africa, and with deep roots in the country that goes back hundreds of years, but I'm not considered Indigenous. So how do I re-indigenize myself? How do I find place and connect myself if my umbilical cord is somewhere in medical waste and my
Back
ancestors
in the
were
atmosphere.
were as Lala June talks about how they were actually also pushed out by these patriarchal societies and patriarchal thinking, and the rupture between that happened between humans and nature that goes back 2,000 years almost. So how do we re-indigenize? How do we rewild? How do we become of place again? And particularly in today's society where we're so nomadic as well. So, where is place? Where is my place? I do a project here. I immerse myself in that place, but it's not my place. I move somewhere else. I've got, people are job hopping. So how do we bring back this connection to place in a way that transcends these old ways and understand that it may not be possible to go back to that way of living? So that's where a lot
Yeah.
of my thinking has been happening in the past 10 years. I haven't got answers yet, but I
So
can
and
understand
I
through
think
academic lots of the problem. I can understand the problem quite well. Mhm.
so for me, it'll be different for every person. But if
Mm,
I talk about my own journey, it is about walking just around my area every day and getting to learn the Yalukit Willem, it's the local Indigenous custodians here, learn their words for the seasons and observe that in context, start to learn their language, and because in their language is the magic of their stories. But I don't know if I'll ever feel Indigenous
mm,
until I am invited. And the way that it happens here is you are adopted into a community, and
mm,
so I'm working to understand this place enough. But even if that invitation to become Indigenous never happens, the more I get to observe and learn about my place, the more in love I fall with it, and the more I
mm,
care for it, which also leaves me quite vulnerable, because if somebody goes and chops a tree down in my local park, then I feel that I've lost that part of my story,
mm,
and that really makes me reflect on how much the Indigenous people would have lost in the 200 years since settlers came here to Australia. So yeah, so that's for me, and I think for every person. But yes,
mm,
with the job hopping and projects all over the place, for me, one of the values underpinned in the values that we've got in the book is really that listening to country, listening to place, and listening
mm,
to the people of that place. I don't think that I can speak for Pretoria or Sydney even.
mm,
Uh, the people of that place can speak for that place, but I can support them in speaking for that place
mm,
through the tools of regenerative development and that we've developed over the last 20 years or so of working.
mm.
So that really is my reflection on
Yeah,
how do we do this.
yeah. Yeah, I think for me, it's not so much about being invited into an Indigenous community and adopting that culture. It is about that in being invited back in and rejoining the community of life as a human being in this community of life. Because it's not otherwise it's just another form of sort of colonization.
I think there's a difference there. There
There's
is a
the
being invited into the tribe, which
Mm-hmm.
isn't really what I mean by that.
No,
And that I think my caring for this place happens
no,
irrespective.
no,
But to be Indigenous here has certain meaning,
no,
which doesn't stop me loving this place any less or more, or
no,
wanting
no,
or feeling the
no,
grief when the tree gets chopped down.
no.
So for me, yeah, they're two different things. I guess it's connected to the baggage that the word Indigenous has here
No,
and the
no,
importance that it has for the people who have lived here for 65,000 years to own the concept of, you know,
mm,
holding this place safe, and
no,
for us to need to step up to be able to join that group.
no.
Yes, so
No,
that
I
that's
think it's
a
it's
good
it's
point.
such a tricky thing to, and I think it's once again our language that is letting us down here, because we have
Mm.
such limited language to really talk about these things and about how we connect and how and different ways of connection, and going back to ancestral knowledge and that ancestral connections to the community of life and the communities around us. So it's an interesting space, I think, to be in. Whether we have answers yet, I don't know, but I think it's something that is evolving, and as I say, what for me is really powerful that has been happening in the past few years is this opening up to this, to make this way of thinking visible to others who were not part of what we now call traditional Indigenous communities.
Mm.
Uh, so that knowledge can be shared and hopefully adopted. So it's not a taking over of the knowledge, but it is an assimilation and an appreciation of the knowledge into this new story that we are trying to build.
Walking together into the future. It's not,
Exactly,
you can
exactly
have
that.
right and left legs, that's fine.
Yeah,
Right and
yeah,
left brains, that's fine. It's how we work
yeah,
together and harmonize.
yeah.
And I thought, just as a final kind of comment from my perspective, Krishna, and maybe you can think while I'm talking about this, about your perspective, but just to ground what for me the ecological worldview or the regenerative worldview or whatever or the Indigenous worldview or whatever that means. If I bring it right down to a sentence, well, of course, there's the fishing story, but I won't go into that one. But into one sentence, it is to increase the vitality and viability
Mm.
of the place, the system in that place, to be able to adapt constructively to change. And if I was to put an example around this, if we talk about regenerative agriculture, uh, so many times I have seen people talk about regenerative agriculture, and all they speak about is the water quality, the yield quality, the nutrient density of the food, the fact that the animals are happier and so forth. Whereas for me, the real regenerative part of this is if the farmers are happier and the children are thriving
Mm.
and the community is having wonderful celebration events together, and where there are able to be differences and those differences are harmonized and the community becomes stronger because of those. So it's not just the physical growing of the food and the healthier biome and all of that. That is the physical side of regenerative development, which is great.
Mm.
But we are social beings within a physical system. And so for me, it is that I always look for the evidence of, the smiles, the
Yeah.
stories, the shared events, the celebrations, the ability to resolve conflict in a way that everyone ends up feeling happy and content, and that they've
Mm.
been heard and that things have been resolved. So that for me is the magic in it.
I fully agree with you. I think this, to go back to your example of the regenerative agriculture, a lot of the discussions there is a way of trying to convince the people who are stuck in this worldview of where everything should be measured and we can only determine something's value if we can measure it. And there's examples and evidence that this has made a physical change, that we can really understand the value that this new approach is bringing. So they're trying to cross this boundary between the philosophical of trying to revitalize a piece of land and having to motivate why this is important and that it is successful, that it is not going to create worse conditions for the people who count things. And the thing they count most, of course, is money. We started off earlier where we talked about that there's three aspects to this worldview. It's the whole, and with
Yeah.
whole comes the values of integrity, of inclusivity. There's values of relationship, which is the values of harmony, of respect, of mutuality, of positive reciprocity, of fellowship, and responsibilities. And then the values of change, which I think is actually the most difficult values to keep on, and that's the ones of humility and non-attachment. So how do we actually let go of all those holy cows, those things that we really feel that is essential to our being, but is not conducive to creating a thrivable society? How do we let go of that? How do we adapt to new things?
Mm. Yeah.
So for
Yeah,
me,
that
those
question of letting go. Yeah.
it's like the question of letting go and being in that the process of understanding that we come together. And I think for me, if I can close off from my side with something, it's a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer,
Mm.
where we talked about agency and we talked about the bigness of all of this and what would this whole worldview mean for us. And she says that because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it is not a question of first getting enlightened and then acting. It's as we work to heal the earth heals us.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that thing that you talked about of what the Regeneratives talk about, how the importance is the work that we do on ourselves, but that by doing the work, we are also healing ourselves.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And so the next session, we could unpack those three levels, maybe, and the
Yes,
values
I
around
think
them. Yeah,
absolutely.
great.
Yeah. Oh,
Awesome.
great.
And I'll try and think of some project examples, just like you have this time, and books and so forth that highlight that. So that was wonderful, Chrisna. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you,
Such
Dominic.
a delight.
Yes.